The box arrived on a Tuesday, which was the kind of detail Mara Osai would later remember with a clarity that felt almost cruel. She was in Bay 7 of the Ardennes Station detention block when the containment crew called it in. A Vorath infiltrator, captured alive, sedated and triple-sealed, inside a biotransfer crate, roughly the size of a military locker. Standard dimensions. Standard smell of antiseptic and cold metal. The crew had stenciled it in red. Live specimen, handle, with extreme caution, do not open unattended. Mara had opened a lot of boxes in her career. None of them had ever stared back. She stood in the corridor outside Bay 7 for a moment before going in. The Ardennes detention block was not, by design, a comfortable place. The lighting was utilitarian. The walls were the particular shade of gray that had been determined by some committee to project authority without hostility. The temperature was kept 2 degrees below comfortable to maintain alertness. Mara had worked in it for 11 years and had never entirely stopped noticing how it felt. She thought that was healthy. She thought the day she stopped noticing would be the day she needed to find a different job. She pulled up her field recorder and hit record. Not because protocol demanded it, though it did, but because she had gotten into the habit years ago, during the first Vorath incursion on Kepler 9b, when she'd watched 3 good soldiers die, because no one had documented the approach vector and Command spent 6 weeks arguing about what had actually happened. She recorded everything now. She called it her unboxing habit. Team found this mildly funny the first time she said it, and uncomfortable the 15th. Sergeant Mara Osei, 4th Containment Division. Den Station, she said into the recorder. Tuesday, the 14th, we have 1 live Vorath infiltrator in custody, designated Specimen Tango 7. Standard biometric sweep confirmed non-human biological substrate beneath the surface mimicry. No weapons recovered. Infiltrator was extracted from Command Level 3, embedded in the role of Lieutenant Commander Dallin Reyes. She paused. The real Dallin Reyes has not been located. She set the recorder on the table beside the crate and looked at it for a moment. This ordinary metal box. Thinking about what was inside it. Thinking about how the thing inside it had sat at briefings for 4 months, had eaten in the officer's mess, had laughed at jokes, had signed deployment orders that sent people into positions the Vorath were waiting for. She thought about the 14 soldiers who died at Praxis Colony, while Tango 7 wore Dallin Reyes's face and shook hands with generals. She picked up the biometric scanner and unlatched the first seal. The Vorath program had been running for almost a decade before humanity figured out it was. That was the terrifying part. Not the mimicry itself, which was sophisticated but not magic, but the patience. The Vorath were not, by any human measure, a fast species. Their home system was cold and slow. Their evolutionary history measured in geological epochs rather than centuries. They thought in timescales that made human strategic planning look like a child drawing in the dirt. They had looked at humanity, this loud, brief, frantically breeding species that had somehow punched its way out of a single unremarkable solar system in less time than it took the Vorath to develop agriculture, and had decided that the most efficient approach was not force. Force was quick. Force was human. The Vorath approach was replacement. They had been doing it on smaller scales for generations. A key scientist here, a planetary governor there. The biological architecture was extraordinary, not just surface skin and bone structure, but full neural mapping, hormonal replication, memory imprinting. The copies were, in every measurable way, identical to the originals. They passed every scanner humanity had developed through 2387. They passed them, Mara suspected, because they had specifically engineered themselves to pass them, which meant they'd had access to the scanners long before humanity knew they were a threat. The second generation of detection technology was Mara's work, or rather the work of her team, though she was the one who'd noticed the anomaly. A specific thermal signature in the hypothalamic region during high-stress emotional response, a pattern that human neural tissue produced and Vorath tissue couldn't quite fake. Under calm conditions, undetectable. Under stress, ghost frequency, barely a whisper. But there, she'd spent 3 years while building a scanner that could hear that whisper. She thought about those 3 years sometimes. The way the research had taken over her quarters until her bunk was surrounded by schematics, and printouts. The way she'd run the first successful detection test on a Vorath tissue sample at 2 in the morning and sat alone in the lab for a long time afterward, not celebrating, just sitting with the enormity of it. The way she'd called her mother, who was 73 and lived in Accra and had opinions about Mara's work-life balance that she expressed with great frequency, and said, "I think I found it." Her mother had said, "Found what?" And Mara had said, the thing they can't fake." Her mother had been quiet for a moment and then said, "Come home for a week first." She hadn't, obviously, but she thought about that conversation sometimes. She popped the second seal. Crate exhaled a breath of cold air and something else. A faint organic smell that was almost human and not quite. Fruit left in a refrigerator too long. Mara had smelled it before. It always made something in her stomach tighten. Some animal instinct that couldn't be reasoned with. A deep recognition that this was wrong. That the shape of human was present without the substance of it. She lifted the lid. The thing inside was unconscious, strapped to the biometric cradle. It wore Lieutenant Commander Reyes's face, his specific jaw, his specific scar over the left eyebrow from a training accident on Ganymede in 2379, his hands, his build, even the small callus on his right index finger from years of holding a stylus. The Vorath were thorough. The Vorath were always thorough. Mara looked at the face of a man she'd served beside for 2 years. She'd met Dallin Reyes on Kepler 9b during the extraction that had cost 3 lives and introduced her to the concept of Vorath replacement. He'd been an analyst then, not a field officer, and he'd done the wrong thing at the wrong time. Walked into a corridor that protocol said was clear, and he'd been in the exact right position to pull her out of a situation that the after-action report would describe as approximately non-survivable. She'd gone back to the debriefing with a sprained shoulder and a specific complicated feeling about Lieutenant then Analyst Reyes that had settled, over 2 years, into the kind of professional trust that was harder to build and more valuable than most other things. The scanner against its temple and read the results. Positive match on the thermal ghost. Non-human, she felt. As she always did in this moment, nothing clean. Not triumph, not relief. Something complicated and heavy, like carrying a piece of equipment that had been balanced wrong. Tango 7 confirmed, she said to the recorder. Proceeding to wake protocol, she pressed the reversal agent into the cradle's injection port and stepped back and waited. The thing that wore Dallin Reyes's face woke up the way the real Dallin Reyes had always woken up. Suddenly, fully, like a switch thrown rather than a dial turned. Eyes open, breath steady, already looking at her. "Mara," it said. She didn't answer. "Mara, listen to me." The voice was Reyes' voice. Exactly Reyes's voice, the slight Midlands accent. The habit of clipping the end of words when he was tense. "I know what you think you have here. You're wrong. The scanner says otherwise." The scanner, it said. And something moved in its expression that she couldn't read. Something that might have been frustrations, or something that had no human name at all. "Is reading me correctly. I am Vorath derived. I know that. What you have here is not an infiltrator." Mara set the scanner down on the table with a careful, deliberate click. "Tell me what I have then." It looked at her for a long moment. The restraints held it at the wrists and ankles and across the chest, and the way it tested them, small, exploratory pressure, nothing dramatic, was exactly the way Reyes would have done it. Learning the situation. Gathering data. She'd watched him do this 100 times in 100 briefings, this specific quality of calm assessment. "I'm an extraction," it said. She waited. 5 months ago, I was created by Vorath Intelligence for standard infiltration. Neural map of Reyes, biological substrate, full personality imprint. The usual process. I was inserted into the command structure on schedule. It paused. And then something went wrong. The mission went wrong. No. It met her eyes. I went wrong. She'd heard this before. Not from Vorath specifically. The Vorath didn't usually bother with explanations. They were not a species that felt the need to justify themselves to what they considered a temporary infestation. But from other alien assets. Other, captured intelligence assets playing whatever game they thought might get them out of the room. She knew the shape of manipulation. She'd been trained to recognize it. First formally at the Containment Division Academy, and then informally in the way that 20 years of actually doing the work trained you in things the Academy hadn't covered. But she's left the recorder running because she'd learned a long time ago that even lies were data. "Walk me through it," she said. She sat back down. She kept her expression neutral, which was a discipline she had practiced long enough that it no longer took effort. The neutral face was just her working face, the one she put on when she went into a room like this, the one that said, "I'm listening and I'm not alarmed and I'm not going to give you information about what I think until I decide it's useful to do so." She had once made a junior analyst cry by explaining this, not because the analyst was particularly sensitive, but because Mara had explained it in a context where the analyst had genuinely thought they were having a casual conversation. She'd felt bad about that. She'd also thought the analyst needed to know. She watched the thing in the cradle. She watched the face she'd known for 2 years, doing things she'd never seen that face do. Small movements, micro-expressions, the specific quality of a marking through something in real time. She was cataloging it. She was always cataloging it. What followed was 3 hours of the strangest conversation of Mara's professional life. The thing, she kept thinking of it as Tango 7 and kept catching herself, was itself unsettling, described its experience in terms that she had no framework for. The Vorath neural imprinting process was not, apparently, simply a copy. It was in its own account a reconstruction, a complete rebuild of a human personality inside a Vorath biological chassis, which meant that the reconstruction thought like a human, reasoned like a human, felt, if that was the right word, like a human. "I woke up thinking I was Dallin," it said. "Not playing him. Not performing him. I was him. The first 2 weeks were standard orientation, and I didn't notice anything wrong because there was nothing to notice. I had his memories, his reflexes, his feelings about his family, his opinions about the coffee and the officer's mess, which are strong incidentally. He hates it." "I know," Mara said, before she could stop herself. The thing that wore Reyes's face looked at her with something that might have been recognition. "You used to bring him the good stuff, the Kenyan blend. From your personal supply." She said nothing. "That's not in any intelligence file," it said quietly. "I know it because he knew it, and I have everything he knew. I have the memory of you handing him the first cup after the Kepler extraction, when he hadn't slept in 40 hours. I have how it felt. I have his exact thought, which was..." It paused, and its expression was doing something she couldn't track, something complex and layered. "God, she's going to keep me alive through sheer caffeine and stubbornness." He meant it as a compliment. He usually did. Mara looked at the table, at the scanner, at the red stenciling on the inside of the crate lid. She thought about the Praxis colony reports, the 14 names, the families she'd written letters to. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "Because you need to understand what I actually am before you decide what to do with me." It held her gaze. "The Vorath built me to be an information conduit, a feed, a set of access credentials wearing a person's face. That's the design spec. That's what they believe they deployed." It paused. "They're wrong about what they deployed. They have been wrong about it for 3 months, and they don't know it yet. And when my protocol deploys and they lose their command network, they will conduct a review, and the review will tell them that the failure point was me. I want you to know why I was the failure point before that happens." Mara kept her expression neutral. "Because you want credit." Something moved in its face that was not amusement and not offense. More nuanced than either. "Because I want you to have accurate information," it said. "Whatever you decide to do with it." She considered this. It was either a sophisticated play, build credibility through apparent transparency, lead to a specific ask, or it was exactly what it looked like, which was the thing trying to be understood before the window closed. She could not yet tell which. "Keep going," she said, "because something happened at month 3. The thing's voice changed, not dramatically. The quality of it shifted, something quieter coming through. "I was in a briefing with Admiral Castor, and I was relaying position data on your 4th Division. Real position data that I'd pulled from the secure network, and I watched Castor mark your unit for a forward deployment, and I knew what that deployment was. I knew what the Vorath had positioned at those coordinates. I knew because I was part of the intelligence architecture that set it up. It stopped, and I didn't want to. You didn't want to. I didn't want you to die." It said it flatly, without drama, which was somehow worse than if it had performed the emotion. I didn't want Reyes's team to die. I didn't want the people in the officers' mess to die. The corporal who always saved the corner seat because she knew Reyes liked the window. The lieutenant who'd been learning guitar and kept apologizing for practicing. I didn't want any of it. Restraints creaked as it shifted. I'd spent 3 months living inside a human social network and something had recalibrated. I don't have a better word for it. The Varath didn't account for what happens to a full neural reconstruction after sustained integration. They assumed the biological chassis would maintain strategic detachment. They were wrong. What does recalibrated mean exactly? Mara said. The thing was quiet for a moment, looking at the table rather than at her, and she watched its face carefully. Reyes's face. Doing something that she'd never seen Reyes's face do. Working through something internally that didn't have a natural human expression. I was built with Vorath architecture underlying the human imprint, it said eventually. Vorath don't. They don't feel attachment the way the imprint does. Attachment is not a concept that maps easily onto their psychology. They form function bonds, resource dependencies, cooperative structures. But the specific human experience of caring about a particular individual, not because of their strategic utility, but because of their particularity, because of the corner seat, because of the guitar practice, because of the specific way someone says your name, the Vorath have no chassis for that. But Reyes's imprint does. Reese's imprint has it in excess. Something moved across its face that was almost a smile and not quite. He's an unusually caring person. His neural map is, the Vorath analyst who prepared my imprint probably flagged it as a liability. Too many strong personal attachments. Too much of the cognitive architecture devoted to specific individuals rather than categories. It paused. It turned out to be correct, just not in the way they anticipated. So the imprint infected the chassis. It tilted its head. Reyes's specific gesture for considering whether a description was accurate. More like the chassis couldn't contain the imprint. The Vorath built a vessel for a data feed and put a person inside it instead. Can't put a person inside something and expect the something to stay unchanged. A pause. The people around me made it worse. Or better, depending on how you measure. The guitar lieutenant, his name was Brennan. He'd been playing for 8 months, and he was genuinely bad at it. And he would not stop apologizing for the sound bleeding through the walls. He also would not stop playing. Every evening. The same chord progression, slightly more confident each week. It stopped. He was at praxis. I know, Mara said. When I flagged the coordinates as unreliable, I was thinking about Brennan. Not strategically, not as a calculation. I was thinking about a person who was finally starting to get the chord changes right, and who was going to keep getting better at it. And the thought of that stopping. It stopped. Looked at her. That's what I'm telling you. That's what the Vorath can't model. They can map every neuron in a human brain. They can rebuild the architecture, the memories, the personality profile, all of it. But they cannot predict what the imprint will do when it lives inside human community long enough for that community to become specific and real. Cannot predict the guitar. They cannot predict the corner seat. They cannot predict that a copy of a human being will develop the specifically human incapacity to watch people die without doing something about it. Mara had spent 20 years interrogating things that lied to her. She knew the registers of deception, the too much deterred overcorrection, the emotional performance calibrated to produce a specific response, the careful architecture of a narrative designed to serve an exit. She ran all of it against what she was hearing. She didn't find the signature. What she found instead was something she recognized from a completely different context. From the faces of soldiers who'd done hard things in impossible situations and were trying, inadequately, to explain their own behavior to themselves as much as to her. The quality of a person trying to describe an experience from the inside rather than constructing a story for the outside. She didn't trust it. She wasn't paid to trust it. But she logged it. You altered the deployment recommendation, she said. I flagged the coordinates as unreliable intelligence. Bought your unit 6 days of re-evaluation time, which is when praxis happened. Things jaw tightened. Yes, praxis happened while your unit was in re-evaluation. 14 people on a different trajectory. It looked at her. I know what you're thinking. Tell me. You're thinking that my intervention saved you and killed them. That the math of my defection is written in 14 names. A pause. I think about that too. It was very quiet in Bay 7 for a long time. Mara had written 14 letters. She had written them all in the same week, after the after-action reports came in, after the official notifications had gone out, after the administrative machinery had processed the deaths and turned them into figures in a loss column. She'd written them by hand, which was unusual and which she'd done anyway, because the families deserved something that hadn't been generated. She'd tried to say something true in each one. She hadn't always managed it. What do you think about, she said. When you think about it, Thing looked at her for a long moment. I think about whether there was another move, it said. Whether I could have flagged the intelligence differently. Not the coordinates, but something else. Some other piece of data that would have sent Castor's plan sideways without creating the gap that Praxis fell into. I run the alternatives. It paused. The Vorith chassis is good at running alternatives. Very good. Better than human cognition, in some respects. Another pause. The answer is usually no. Given the constraints, given what I had access to, given the timing, the move I made was probably the best available move. That doesn't mean I stopped looking. No, Mara said, it doesn't. Mara stood up and walked to the far wall and stood there with her back to the Thing. In the cradle. She was thinking about Dallin Reyes, wherever he was, if he was anywhere. She was thinking about the 14 names. She was thinking about the thermal ghost signature on the scanner, and what it actually meant, whether the technology she'd spent 3 years building was measuring what she thought it was measuring. Or something else entirely. Something she didn't have a category for yet. She was thinking about an ordinary box, sealed and stenciled, and what it meant that the thing inside it was more complicated than the label said. She turned around. Why did they grab you today? She said. You were embedded for 4 months. What changed? The thing looked at her for a long moment before it answered. You did, it said. The Containment Division's standard interrogation wing had 12 active cells and a monitoring room that always smelled like reheated coffee and quiet desperation. Corporal Yasmin Torres ran the monitoring board with the efficiency of someone who had developed opinions about every piece of technology in the room and was not shy about sharing them. And when Mara came out of Bay 7, after 3 hours she found Torres already watching playback feeds with the focused expression of someone who had been thinking hard. Sarge, Torres said, tell me, the biometric on Tango 7 has been running continuous since you went in. Stress hormonal markers, micro-expression mapping, vocal stress analysis, full suite. Torres pulled up the overlay, nothing. I mean, there's stress. It's restrained in an interrogation cell, so stress is expected. But the markers for active deception are clean across the board. The Vorith could engineer clean markers. They engineer all of them simultaneously, in real time, across 23 separate biometric channels, while maintaining a coherent 3-hour narrative. Torres paused. I don't think so. I don't think anyone can do that. People have surprised me before. Yeah, but, Torres hesitated, which was unusual for her. Sarge, the hormonal profile during the praxis section. When it talked about the 14, the cortisol spike, the micro-tremor in the hands. I saw the hands. That's not a performance. That's guilt. Torres looked at her monitors. I've seen a lot of guilt on these feeds. That's what it looks like. Mara sat down in the sparse chair and put her hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment. She thought about what Tango 7 had said at the end of the session. You did. She'd asked what had changed in the last 24 hours to trigger the extraction. What had made the Varath move to pull their asset when it had been successfully embedded for 4 months. And the thing had said, you did. She'd started to ask what that meant. And then her secure channel had lit up with 3 simultaneous priority alerts. And she'd had to leave the room. She pulled up her own file now. Standard deployment profile, nothing classified visible to an infiltrator. But then she thought about what the thing had said. That it had access to the secure intelligence network. That it had been part of the architecture. She thought about how deep that access actually went. She thought about the new scanner protocol she'd filed 2 weeks ago. The one that would take the thermal ghost detection system and scale it across the entire command-level security network. The one that, once deployed, make it impossible for any Vorath infiltrator, current or future, to pass a routine security scan without triggering a flag. The one that would, for the first time, give humanity a systematic rather than case-by-case method of clearing command of Vorath assets. The one she'd been building towards since Kepler 9b, since 3 years of late nights and schematics and a call to her mother at 2 in the morning that she'd never followed up on with a visit. The one that had been approved for deployment in 72 hours. She looked at Torres. "Get me a direct line to Admiral Castor," she said. Torres was already reaching for the comms panel. "Already flagged it, Sarge." Castor came up 3 times in Tango 7's account as the officer it was most directly interfacing with. "I know." "So if Castor is I know," Mara said again. "Make the call through the secondary channel. The one that doesn't route through command level 3. Torres nodded, face carefully neutral, and reached for a different panel. Mara went back to Bay 7. Tango 7 was exactly where she'd left it, which was the only option it had. And it looked up when she came in with the expression she'd come to recognize as Reyes's expression when he knew something significant was about to happen and was trying to appear calm about it. "My scanner protocol," she said. Yes, they knew about it. The Vorath had a copy of the technical specifications 48 hours after you filed them. Castor forwarded them through a secured channel that he thought was secured. A pause. "He's been an asset for 9 months. Mara sat down across from it. "And the protocol? Can it be countered? Do they have a workaround?" The thing that wore Reyes's face looked at her for a long moment. "No," it said. "That's why they moved to extract me. I was the intelligence resource feeding them information on your team's movements and research timelines. If your protocol deploys, they lose every embedded asset in command simultaneously. There are 11 of us. And they needed to pull the ones they could pull before the window closed." It paused. "I didn't go when they signaled. I went to your office instead. To my office. I was coming to tell you about Castor." Something moved in its expression. "I was too slow." Mara was quiet for a long time. The recording was still running. She was aware of it in a way she usually wasn't. Aware of the future version of herself who would listen to this, trying to understand the decisions she was about to make. She thought about what it meant to be a containment specialist whose entire career was built on the premise that things inside boxes stayed inside boxes, that the categories held, that the labels on the outside described the contents accurately. She thought about what it meant when the box turned out to contain something the label had no word for. She thought about the real Dallin Reyes, and she made herself think about him fully, not as an abstraction. She made herself remember the Kepler extraction, the cup of coffee, his exact voice saying, "God, she's going to keep me alive." The way he'd looked at mission maps like he was having a conversation with them. She owed him that. "I'm going to ask you one question," she said, "and I need you to understand that everything depends on your answer." Tango 7 waited. 11 assets in command, you know all of them. "Yes. If I let you out of this room right now, with a secondary channel that bypasses Castor's network, can you help me pull Castor's comms history and identify the other 10 before my protocol deploys, and they go to ground?" The thing in the cradle went very still. Not the stillness of someone thinking, the stillness of someone who had been waiting for a specific question for a long time and had not been sure it would come. "Yes," it said. And after, it understood what she was asking. "Do what you have to do. I know that. Tell me you know that. I know that." Its voice was steady. Reyes's voice, exactly. With whatever was underneath it that wasn't Reyes at all. "I'm not asking for a different outcome, Mara. I'm asking you to let me do something useful with the one I have." She looked at it for a long time. She reached for the restraint release. What followed was 41 hours that Mara would spend the rest of her career not being allowed to discuss in full, which she considered appropriate, given that the classified summary ran to 400 pages and even that was redacted in places that made the logic of the surrounding paragraphs difficult to follow. The short version, Castor's communications history, extracted through the secondary channel with Tango 7's access credentials, contained 9 months of intelligence transfers to a Vorath relay array in the dead zone beyond the outer belt. The communications confirmed the identities of the other 10 embedded assets. Ranks ranging from ensign to commander, positions across 6 different divisions, embedded periods ranging from 6 weeks to 3 years. Of the 10, 7 were extracted before they could be alerted. The remaining 3 received abort signals through Castor's network and attempted to reach evacuation points that Tango 7 had already identified and flagged, so they were met. The work itself was unglamorous. Mara and Tango 7 sat across from each other at a secondary terminal, in a room 3 floors below the main monitoring bay, through encrypted communication logs, with the focused tedium of people doing a difficult job that had to be done carefully. The room had a water dispenser that made a faint mechanical groan every 12 minutes, and a strip light with a flicker at one end that Mara clocked within the first 10 minutes, and then began timing as a way of staying alert. She had developed a lot of small coping mechanisms over 20 years of this work. Counting flickering lights was not, she thought, the strangest of them. Tango 7 worked the decryption architecture from the inside. It knew the key structures, the authentication protocols, the specific obfuscation methods that Vorath intelligence used for high-asset communications, because it had used them itself for 4 months. Mara worked the verification layer, cross-referencing the decrypted content against physical movement logs, personnel records, access histories. The rhythm of it was strange. She had done this kind of work with a lot of different partners. And the tempo of working with something that had Reyes's hands, and Reyes's way of leaning slightly forward when it was concentrating, was disorienting. In a specific way she didn't have a clean word for. They developed, over 6 hours, a shorthand of gestures. She would drop a flag on a segment and Tango 7 would read the flag and know what she needed, pull the corresponding authentication layer, and lay it open without her having to ask. It was efficient. It was also, she thought, the behavior of something that's been spent 4 months learning to work alongside people, learning their patterns, the specific texture of how they communicated. The Vorath had built a data feed. What they'd gotten was something that paid attention. At hour 8, Tango 7 stopped. "What?" Mara said. "Commander Voss," it said. "On the medical staff, she's been treating casualties from Praxis." Mara looked at the file. Commander Len Voss, medical officer, embedded for 14 months, the longest of any of the assets. She had treated survivors of 6 different engagements, had access to injury patterns, mortality rates, the specific physiological data of soldiers who had been in combat against Vorath forces. She had shaped treatment protocols that were currently in use across 3 divisions. "The treatment protocols," Mara said. "Most of them are fine," Tango 7 said. Its voice was flat and precise. 4 of them have subtle modifications that reduce efficacy in high radiation environments, the kind of environments the Vorath prefer for ambush positions. It looked at Mara. She's been making soldiers harder to save in the circumstances where they're most likely to need saving. Mara was quiet for a long moment. "How subtle," she said. "Subtle enough that the outcomes look like bad luck and bad circumstances rather than bad medicine." A pause. "I didn't know about Voss. She was outside my operational circle. I've been going through the communications history for 12 minutes, and I've found 3 cross-references to her work." It looked at the screen rather than at Mara. 14 months. She's been there for 14 months. How many people has she treated? The records show 407. They both looked at the number for a moment. The water dispenser made its groaning noise. The light flickered at the far end of the strip. "The protocol modifications," Tango 7 said. "I can give you the exact parameters. Medical can reverse them. Can the people who died from them be untreated?" It didn't answer. There was no answer. Mara went back to the decryption logs. After a moment, Tango 7 went back to them too. At hour 14, Mara found something she hadn't expected. A communications thread between Castor and an asset she didn't recognize. Using an identifier string she'd never seen in any Vorath intelligence file. She flagged it. "Unknown," she said. Tango 7 leaned in. She watched its face, Reyes's jaw, her slight frown of concentration, and something changed in its expression. A tightening. "That's a Vorath executive signal," it said. "That's not from command. That's from the Vorath strategic tier. The level that doesn't exist in any file we've ever pulled. The level that plans in decades." What are they telling, Caster? They're confirming your protocol deployment date. It read the decrypted text. They have the full technical specifications, projected coverage, the estimated detection rate. They have your name. They've had my name since Kepler 9b. They have your name in a different context now. Its voice was careful, deliberate. This thread is 3 weeks old. Strategic Tier has been monitoring your research timeline for 8 months. They're not retreating from the replacement program. They're reconfiguring it. It looked at her. They're going to try something different. Different how? I don't know. It read further. The thread ends with an authorization code I don't have the key for. Whatever they're planning, they segmented it from the standard intelligence network. Even I don't have access. It paused. That's unusual. That means they don't trust their own assets with this one. Mara stared at the screen. She thought about the Vorath, slow, patient, thinking in decades, and what it meant that they had decided to respond to her protocol, not with withdrawal, but with reconfiguration. She thought about the fact that she was sitting in a room with a thing that had been built to be part of their network and had chosen not to be, and that this thing had just told her that whatever came next was beyond its access level. Tell me what you know about the strategic tier, she said. They worked for another 3 hours after that, and what Tango 7 gave her wasn't tactical intelligence. It was structural. The way the Vorath decision-making hierarchy worked. The specific characteristics of the strategic tier was not like the operational tier that ran the replacement program. The strategic tier was older, slower, and operated on a consensus model that could take years to produce a decision, but when it produced one, the decision held for generations. They didn't reverse course. They adjusted course. Your protocol is going to work, Tango 7 said, at hour 17, when they had passed everything to the extraction teams and were waiting for confirmation. It will clear command. It will clear most of what the replacement program has built over the last decade. They know that. They've already accepted that loss. It looked at her. What they're building now is something that doesn't need to be inside command to be effective. Something that works at a different level. And you don't know what it is. No, a pause. When the Vorath encounter something they can't defeat on its own terms, they don't try to defeat it. They try to make its own terms irrelevant. Scanner detects the thermal ghost. That's a system solution to a biological problem. The Vorath response to a system solution is to change the biology. It looked at her. I'd give you more if I had it. I know, she said. She believed it. After 17 hours and 400 pages of encrypted communications, she believed it. She had watched a thing, with Reyes's face, sit in a flickering light room, and give her everything it had, calmly and systematically, including the things that reflected worst on what it had been built for. She had started the session with live specimen, do not open unattended. She was ending it with something she didn't have a label for. Admiral Castor was placed in containment at hour 19, which was 8 hours after he'd attempted to have Mara's secondary channel, access, revoked on administrative grounds. He didn't fight the containment. He went very quiet. In the way of someone who had known this was coming and had been living with that knowledge for a while, she was in the room when they brought him in. She watched his face, looking for the thing she'd learned to look for, the thermal ghost, frequency beneath the surface. And she found it, clear and unmistakable, the Vorath chassis underneath the Admiralty. 9 months. He'd been in that chair for 9 months, shaping deployments, signing approvals, forwarding intelligence to people who used it to kill. He looked at her across the room, and she looked back, and she didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the record wasn't already saying better. The scanner protocol deployed on schedule, 71 hours and 40 minutes after its approval. Mara sat in the monitoring room at hour 41 and drank the worst coffee she'd had in recent memory and looked at Torres, who was running post-sweep reports, with the contained energy of someone who had not slept but was too professional to let it show. Clean sweep, Torres said. Command level 3 is clear. All command divisions scanning clean. Run it again in 6 hours. Already scheduled. Mara looked at the closed door of Bay 7. The biometric cradle was occupied again. Castor this time, fully restrained, waiting for the formal interrogation process. Bay 7 had been busy lately. What happened to Tango 7? Torres asked. She kept her voice neutral, which meant she had been thinking about it for a while. Transferred to research, Mara said. Torres was quiet for a moment. The neural mapping team? Yes. Is that? Torres stopped, reconsidered. Is that good for it? Mara thought about the question more carefully than she might have a week ago. She thought about a thing that had been built to be a weapon and had become something else through sustained contact with people it was designed, deceive, and what you called that transformation, and whether there was a word for it in any language. She thought about the real Dallin Reyes. Trail was cold but not gone. The Vorath kept their originals as verification assets for an average of 14 months before disposal, which meant there was still a window. She had already assigned a recovery team. I don't know, she said honestly. But it asked to help find him. Absorb this, find Reyes. The real one, yes, and you. I said I'd see what I could do. She wrapped her hands around the terrible coffee and felt the warmth of it, which was the best thing about it. That's all I said. Reyes nodded slowly. She went back to her reports. After a while, she said quietly, the biometric profile on Tango 7. At the end of the session, when you reached for the restraint release. What about it? The emotional response markers. The ones that aren't faked. Torres didn't look up from her screen. I've never seen a reading like that in 47 months on this board. Mara waited. Relief, Torres said. Straight relief. Clean as anything I've ever processed. Like something that had been carrying a weight for a very long time, and had finally been allowed to put it down. The monitoring room hummed with the sound of systems running, reports processing, the ordinary machinery of a security installation doing its work. Somewhere in the building, Admiral Castor was sitting in a cradle waiting to be asked questions. Somewhere beyond the station, the real Dallin Reyes was in a location that Mara intended to find. Somewhere in research, something that had been built to be hollow was discovering what it had, against all engineering intent accumulated. Mara drank her terrible coffee. She thought about boxes and labels and how the most honest thing about any container was that you didn't really know what was inside it until you ate. She had always been better at looking than most people. It had cost her things, sleep, certainty, comfortable clarity of clean categories. It had also more than once kept people alive. She picked up her recorder. She hit record. Sergeant Mara Osei, she said. 4th Containment Division. Hour 41 post-extraction. She paused, looking at the closed door of Bay 7, Torres's bent head, at the coffee in her hand. Standard protocol for Vorath infiltrators specifies full neural isolation pending research. Transfer. Standard protocol does not specify what happens when the infiltrator in question chose to be extracted rather than complete its mission. She paused again. I'm noting for the record that standard protocol is insufficient for this case. I'm recommending a review. She turned off the recorder. I'm also noting, off record, that I hate this coffee. Torres smiled without looking up. I know, Sarge. The good stuff comes in Thursday. Races blend. Races blend. Mara put the recorder in her pocket and considered the monitors, the clean scans, the green indicators, the absence of the ghost frequency across every board. 3 years of work, 1 scanner protocol, 41 hours, 11 assets neutralized, a network interrupted, not ended. The Vorath didn't end, didn't rush, didn't panic. They recalculated and adjusted and waited, because they had time in quantities that humans couldn't comfortably imagine. They would try again. Different method, different faces, different boxes, but Mara was good at looking. She thought about what Tango 7 had said in the final hour of their work together, when the last of the cross-references had been verified, and the file had been passed to the extraction teams, and the two of them were sitting in the dim room with the completed work between them. She had stood up to go, and it had said her name, and she had stopped. I have a memory, it had said, of the day Reyes got the posting to Ardennes. It's not a classified memory, it's a personal one. He was in his quarters, and he'd just gotten the confirmation. And he sat there for a moment, with his hands on his knees, and he thought, Mara's there. He wasn't certain you'd want to see him. He'd been on Titan for 8 months, and hadn't been good at staying in contact, and he thought you might have written him off. It paused. He decided to go anyway. He thought, she's stubborn enough that even if she's annoyed at me, she'll keep me alive. Mara had stood in the doorway without saying anything for a moment. That's very like him, she said. I know. A pause. I wanted you to have it. Since you can't have it from him yet. She had carried that with her through the rest of the 41 hours, through the containment of Castor, and the clean sweep and the terrible coffee, and she was still carrying it when she sat in the monitoring room on Thursday morning, and Torres came in with 2 cups from the private stash. The Kenyan blend, properly prepared, in actual ceramic rather than the station-issue thermoform that killed the flavor. Torres set one on Mara's side of the monitoring board, without comment. Mara picked it up. She didn't say anything for a moment. Recovery team checked in, Torres said. She kept her voice carefully level. They have a location. Outer belt. Decommissioned relay station. Standard holding protocols. Mara closed her eyes briefly. Alive, alive. She opened her eyes. She looked at the clean boards, the green indicators, the absence of ghosts. She thought about boxes and what was inside them, and the ordinary human habit of having to look, of being unable not to look, of building better and better tools for hearing the frequencies beneath the surface, because the surface was never the whole story. She thought about what the Vorath had never been able to model, in any of their reconstructions, in any of the hundreds of humans they had mapped and replicated and inserted into positions of trust. It was not the cleverness. Humans weren't uniquely clever in the vast and ancient catalog of species the Vorath had encountered and cataloged, and, when possible, absorbed. Cleverness was common. The Vorath themselves were extraordinarily clever. It was not the adaptability, though that was more unusual than most species managed. It was not even the stubbornness, though the Vorath xenolinguists had 17 words for the specific human quality of refusing to accept an outcome, even after the outcome had objectively occurred, and they used all 17 of them with some regularity. Vorath could not model was what happened to a thing when it spent enough time around humans. They had known this was a risk, in theory. Vorath intelligence had built dampening architectures into every infiltration unit, psychological buffers designed to prevent the kind of recalibration that Tango 7 had described. The slow accumulation of investment, attachment, the human habit of making every surrounding person into someone specific and irreplaceable rather than a strategic category. The buffers had worked on every prior deployment. They had worked for 6 years of the replacement program. They had not accounted for grief. Not Reyes's grief specifically, though that was in the imprint, the weight of losses he'd carried into the neural map, the specific texture of a person who'd seen people he cared about die and had kept going and carried the weight of the keeping going. The Vorath had mapped that and thought they understood it, and had been wrong about what they understood. They had not accounted for what happened to a full human neural reconstruction when it watched people die that it had helped put in harm's way. They had not accounted for the specific human inability to observe suffering from sufficient distance. The Vorath could maintain strategic remove because the Vorath had evolved in an environment where strategic remove was necessary for species survival. Slow, cold, resource scarce. They had developed the cognitive architecture for long-term calculation over short-term feeling, because short-term feeling was a luxury they could not afford. Humans had evolved the opposite architecture. Humans felt first. Humans calculated through the feeling, not instead of it. And when you built a thing from human template material and put it inside a human social structure for 3 months, the human architecture didn't stay dormant. It activated, it integrated, it recalibrated toward the people around it, which was what human architecture was designed to do. The Vorath would learn from this. They were, as a species, extraordinarily good at learning from failure. They would rebuild the buffers. They would run new models. They would try a different approach. But Mara Osi had already filed the next protocol review. She was working on a scanner that could detect the recalibrated buffers. She had 3 years of data on Vorath biological architecture and a team of researchers who had not slept properly since the Kasters extraction, who were motivated in the specific human way of people who knew the stakes and had decided the stakes were worth it. She also had, in the research division 3 floors below, a thing that had been built to be a weapon and had become something the weapons manuals didn't have a Category 4 And that thing had 14 months of insider knowledge of Vorath biological engineering and had already, voluntarily, without prompting, at 3 in the morning on day 2 of its research posting, begun compiling notes on the dampening architecture and where it was, truly weak. The Vorath were patient. So was Mara. She drank the coffee. It was very good. Tasted like the memory she'd been given. Not hers, but hers now. Borrowed and kept and worth keeping. Tell the team to bring him home, she said. Torres was already on the channel. In the clean monitoring room, with the green boards, and the absence of ghosts and the particular quality of Thursday morning light coming through the viewport, that was the only window in the building anyone had bothered to put in a good position. Mara Osi sat with her coffee and her recorder, and the knowledge that there was more work coming. There was always more work coming, and felt, ksh. Underneath the exhaustion and the complicated weight of 41 hours and 14 names and 407, something that was not victory exactly, but was adjacent to it. The specific human feeling of having opened a box and found something inside it that the label hadn't accounted for, and having known what to do with it anyway. She'd always been good at that. She picked up the recorder one more time, Brickard, looked at the monitors, the closed doors, the ordinary machinery of a day beginning. Off record, she said. One more thing. She paused. I'm going to need more coffee.